So let's do HTML and JavaScript now. So on CodePen, you don't have to actually put like head and body and stuff like that. We're just putting what's inside the body. So we can just start putting some HTML in here. I could put, for example, an H1. I less than 3 JavaScript. There you go. It renders right down here. Lovely. So what is this whole thing? What do we call these things? Let's make a button too. Whoops. So our button and our heading there, what are they both examples of? The tags, right? So, in fact, they're 2 tags apiece. An opening tag and a closing tag. And the entire thing is called, anybody know? An element. So the whole thing's an element, consists of an opening and closing tag and contents. Everything in between the opening and closing tag are the contents of that element. Anatomy of an HTML element. What about stuff like this? What if I say my heading class equals fancy? So now I've got an ID and a class. What are ID and classes examples of in HTML? Anybody know, anatomy of an HTML wise, what we call those things? Anybody know? Attributes. So HTML attributes, things like ID and class. ID for identifying, class for classifying. Talk more about those, but as far as the anatomy of an HTML element goes, those are attributes. So we want to do something. With JavaScript, we can actually dictate some actual behavior. So let's just put alert, hello, and right when the page loads, up pops hello. But that's kind of boring. We want something to happen in response to something else. Doing a bunch of stuff when the page loads, that's not most of what we're going to be doing. Most of what we're going to be doing is having something happens because something else happened. Like this. When one thing happens, do something else. So an awful lot of the programming we're going to be doing is going to take this form. We're going to be event-driven. We're going to wait for an event to happen on a page, and then we're going to do something in response to that event. So what we actually need to do when the page loads is tell it to start waiting for that event to happen. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do something when the button gets clicked. To bake an apple pie from scratch, first you must create the universe. To wait for something to happen to a button, first you must grab the button from the page. Anybody know how to grab stuff from the page using JavaScript? Go for it. Kieran, right? Yeah, that's one way to do it. Document.getElementById. So document. Anytime we're dealing with the contents of the page, we're going to deal with this document object. We're dealing with the DOM, D-O-M, Document Object Model. Most of our JavaScript programming this week is going to be dealing with the DOM. We're going to spend this week doing plain old vanilla JavaScript, no libraries, and the next 2 weeks we're going to be doing React. So this week we're going to learn how to actually do stuff without any libraries. So we're going to be dealing with the DOM a lot, which means we're going to be saying document.stuff. GetElementById is one way to do that. But our button doesn't have an ID, so we can't use it. And we're not going to give it one. We're going to have to do something else. Anybody know another way? Here's another way. Query selector. There's query selector and there's query selector all. Query selector all finds all matches. Query selector finds just the first one. So that's a method that you can call on that document object. And you need to give it a selector, strangely enough, to identify which element on the page it's grabbing. So this uses the same syntax as a CSS selector. Anybody know what that is? So in CSS, you'll have a selector followed by some curly braces, and then it'll have some rules inside it. So that first part, the selector that tells it which elements on the page the rule applies to, that's the same syntax we can use in query selector to identify which elements on the page we're trying to grab. It takes a string, single quotes, double quotes, doesn't matter in JavaScript. Truly the only difference is which character you have to escape. So if you have a string that says don't, well, if I use single quotes, it's going to think this is the end of the string. but it's not, so we have to backslash it. Similarly, if you have a string that says, say, yeah, like that, that's going to be a problem. As soon as it sees the second double quote, it's going to think it's the end of the string, so you'd have to backslash those, escape those. So that's the only difference between single and double quotes in JavaScript. Doesn't matter, just be consistent. Most style guides out there use single quotes, so we're going to use single quotes for the sake of simplicity and consistency. So anyway, we pass in a string, which can be any CSS selector. The simplest possible selector, just the name of the element, what type of element it is, like button. That's going to find the first button on the page. Query selector all with the same selector would find all buttons on the page and return it in an array-like structure. Not technically an array, but we'll deal with that later. So query selector would find us that button. Now, to do something with that button, we'll probably want to save it to a variable. So how do we make a variable in JavaScript? Right, var. No. So var, that's the old way. But we are living in an ES6 world. Yeah? Let or const. The new way, in ES6, we have two new keywords for creating variables, let and const. Const sounds like constant, but really, the only difference between let and const is const cannot be ever completely reassigned with equal signs. You can still mutate objects that are declared using const. So what we're going to do is use const unless we know we're going to reassign it later, in which case we will use let. We will never use var. Const and let are supported in all the major browsers now, and they have some serious advantages. So we're just not going to mess with var anymore. In a couple days, we'll demonstrate the difference between them. For now, just know let and const are better. And const can prevent some errors by avoiding a reassignment. So we're going to use const unless we know we need let. And in fact, it will be days before we ever have to use let. Probably the first time we'd ever have to do it is if we were doing a for loop, because you're going to have I reassigned lots of times, right? But hey, if you're reaching for a for loop in JavaScript, there's probably a better way anyway. Point being, let's use const. So const button equals document.querySelector button. We'll grab the first button it finds on the page and save it to a variable. So then, now that we have it, we need to do this. We say when something happens to that button, do something else. Anybody know how to do this? Yeah. Add event listener. Fancy. Yep. There's a couple ways we could do this. The way we're not going to do it, but that totally works. We could say button dot on something. There are a whole bunch of properties on elements that let us wait for certain events, like on click, on submit, on mouse, mouse down, mouse up, mouse over, mouse out, mouse enter, mouse leave, that kind of stuff. On click. Now, generally speaking, things are camel cased in JavaScript. Unfortunately, some of the stuff from that original 10-day sprint wasn't super consistent about this. On click is actually all lowercase, not a capital C. But anyway, so we could actually set the on click property and set it to something that we want to do, like a function. So let's write a function. We could write a function right here, an anonymous function, but we won't. Cool thing about functions in JavaScript, they're first-class citizens. They can be assigned to variables. They can be passed around as arguments to other functions. We call those callbacks. We'll talk more about them. But the point is, functions can do anything that any other piece of data can do. So let's make one. There are lots of ways to make functions. Simplest one would be a good old function declaration like this. Function say yeah. And that's the syntax. The word function, the name of your function, open close parens, open close curly braces. So we'll just do something simple like say yeah. So now we want to assign that function to this property on click. I do not put open close parentheses here. That would actually run the function, which means what would we be assigning to on click? Its return value, right? It would evaluate the right side of the equal sign first if I had the parentheses there, and it would not assign that function to on click. It would assign the return value which is nothing. We didn't return anything. It's undefined. So this would be the same as just typing undefined here. Not what we want. We want the actual function itself. Because you can do that. You can totally assign a function to a variable or a property or something. Does it work? Euro. That's right. Sure does. Yeah. Just because I wanted it to be an alert. Yeah, that's all. Yeah, that's why it's a pop-up. Don't use alert. Alert's super annoying. That's the fastest way to get some output on the screen right this second. Yeah.
Why did you use the parentheses again?
So if I put open close parentheses over here, it would run right away. So as soon as it evaluated this line of JavaScript, it would evaluate the right side. It would run the function, which we don't want to happen. We only want to run the function after the event occurs, right? Oh, okay. So it would run it right then, and then what it would assign to onClick is its return value, which is nothing because we didn't return anything. So yeah, we actually want the function itself to be assigned to that property. Interesting thing about function declarations like this, we can actually move it down here, and it would still work due to something called hoisting. If you use a regular old function declaration, it actually declares that thing as soon as it comes into scope. So you can actually call it higher up in the source code than you defined it. So on the other hand, we said functions can be anonymous, and we said that they can be assigned to variables and everything else. So we could do something like this. Const say yeah equals an anonymous function. Now we're just taking an anonymous function and assigning it to a variable. Basically the same thing. Pretty much the only difference between these two syntaxes is this now doesn't work. There's no hoisting when you do it this way. So we would actually have to declare the thing before we use it, which isn't so bad. And there's some advantages to doing it this way. The consistency with saving things as variables and the way that const works, you're not going to accidentally reassign it because you can't reassign something declared with const. And later on, we're going to learn some things about certain types of functions that actually make this a little better too. So this is a way that we'll do it a lot. We'll actually just create anonymous functions and assign them to variables. But now this is the same thing. Does it work? Yeah. Cool. So that's pretty boring. An alert is terrible and annoying. So let's do something a little better with it. So in HTML, you have basically a tree structure with your HTML element at its root, things like head, body, all these other things, all these nodes in the tree. And each of those nodes can be one of two things, really. It can either be an element or a text node, just some text. So right now, we've actually got 4 nodes here. We've got an H1 element. We've got a text node that's a child of that element. We've got a button element, and we've got some text, a text node of that button. So, yeah, just some vocab there. If you want to mess with the contents of an element, anybody know how to do that? How to change the text that's inside of it? In between the 2 tags. Yeah, this stuff. You know how to change that? You can use inner HTML. That's one way to do it. Another way you can do it, we'll do inner HTML tomorrow. Another way to do it, text content. If you know it's all text and you don't want to actually write any HTML in there, you could use text content. So what if we do this? I want to, instead of saying yeah, I want to say whatever's in the H1. How would I do that? To make an apple pie from scratch, you must first create the universe. To do something with that H1, we must first grab the H1 from the page. What do I type next? Yep. Document.querySelector. The string H1 ought to do it. And then we could get the text content by simply saying H1.text. Well, maybe if I saved it to a variable first. Here, let's call it heading. to make the point that it doesn't have to be the same as the variable name. Then I can say heading.text content. This time it is camel cased. Let's see if it's all true. I heart JavaScript. Heck yeah.
So, query selector, what that does is like it looks for all the source of the HTML.
Yep, and finds one that matches. And all the selectors we've used so far just look at the tag name.
How come we're not using any semicolons?
They are optional, is the long and short of it. There's something in JavaScript called automatic semicolon insertion. So they are technically optional, and I decided last year to stop using them in this class because I think they look hideous in React. In the old days, it was risky to do that because a lot of times your JavaScript would be pre-processed or compressed in such a way that if you didn't put the semicolons in yourself, they wouldn't get put in the right place. That's really no longer the case. The modern tooling doesn't really have a problem with it. Some style guides suggest that you always use semicolons. I just ask that you be consistent. If you're going to use them correctly. If you're not, I don't care. And I'm not going to do it on screen because I'm now out of the habit for the sake of teaching the class, and it just doesn't matter, so I'm not going to do it. Yeah, it doesn't actually matter. Line breaks are also the end of a statement, except when they're not. And when they're not is generally expected. So for example, if I put a dot at the beginning of the next line, it would know that's actually part of the line above. But if I don't, it knows it's part of a new statement. So anyway, text content, yeah. It's going to find the first one. Query selector all would find all of them. Query selector will just find the first one. So sometimes you need a better selector than that. Yeah, then we need a better selector, which we'll do in just a minute. Yep. So text content we know can now read the content of an element, but it can also set the content of an element. We can actually assign this property. What do you say, Rich? What do you say?
Like what we should name it?
Cool. All right. Click the button. Yeah, it totally works. Totally works. Text content. But your friend Omari brings up a good point. What if we don't want it to be the first instance of something on a page? Let's put a couple paragraphs in here. Why is it doing that? Welcome to my page. New paragraph. So happy you're here. By the way, all one line breaks between really doesn't matter. White space in HTML is either ignored or it's compressed down to one space. I could put 5 spaces in between here and it'd look exactly the same. I could put a line break in there and it would look exactly the same. White space is generally ignored or compressed down to one space. So here we go, 2 paragraphs. And I want to change the second one. Let's update the name of our function here because it's no longer accurate. Let's say update text. And we'll change it down here too. Update text. And this time we want the second paragraph. So how about we give that paragraph either an ID or a class? How about an ID of sentiment? This is the sentiment paragraph. I'm so happy you're here. So how should I change this selector? Anybody know? Anybody know CSS selector syntax for an ID? Yep. That's right. Pound, or as kids today call it, which you are, hashtag. Hash sentiment. That will do it. That picks that particular paragraph. I don't want to call it heading anymore. It's a paragraph, so I'll name this variable P. Click. Sure enough, we got the second one. What if we wanted a class instead of an ID? Anybody know the difference? So an ID, you should only have one element of that ID on the page. It's illegal to have multiple elements with the same ID. Now, browsers are very forgiving. It's still going to render the page just fine, but you might get some inconsistent or unpredictable behavior with JavaScript because you're not really supposed to do that. If you need more than one thing with the same label, you need classes. ID for identification, class for classification. Yes, sir?
I didn't really understand the whole the concept of IDs in class, and I was going over the Code Academy. What is that for?
It's usually for CSS or JavaScript, honestly. It's to say these kinds of paragraphs are this thing, or these kinds of list items are an example of this kind of thing. And these are different. So maybe you have a bunch of list items on the page. Certain ones you don't want the bullets to appear next to them because of the type of thing that they represent, the type of data they represent. So you might give those a class and then write a CSS rule that targets just those list items that you don't want the bullet next to. Or you have some text that you want to be a little bigger than it would ordinarily be. So you target it with a class. And class would be for multiple instances. ID would be for one instance that you want to treat differently from all the others. Yeah, but if you need to style something differently or grab it with JavaScript, you may need a class or an ID. Sometimes you don't need them, but sometimes you do. Yep. So sentiment. Now, if it's a class instead of an ID, it's not a hash, but a dot. Correct. So a dot for a class. Still work? Yep, sure does. But we said we weren't going to use onClick, right? We said we were going to use add event listener, as our dear friend Andrew suggested. So, thing about onClick is I could write on the very next line, button onClick equals something else. And guess what? I will have just blown away the old value. It won't do both things. Without event listener, you could have multiple event listeners on the same event for the same item if you needed to. So, you might need to do that sometimes. So more modern way, add event listener. So wouldn't you know it, every HTML element has a method on it called add event listener. It is indeed camel cased. So that's what we're doing. We're doing this, right? We're listening for an event to occur, and then we're telling it what to do. So unsurprisingly, add event listener takes two arguments. What are the two arguments? These two things. The event that we're listening for and what should happen when it occurs. So the first argument is click, the event. And then what should happen? Update text. Not update text, open close parentheses. That would be undefined. It would actually run it right there on line 8 and would assign nothing to the event listener. So we want the function itself, as though the function were just another variable because, hey, the function's just another variable. We're not the ones invoking update text. We never call that function ourselves. JavaScript calls it for us when we click. Therefore, we should never be putting those parentheses there because that would actually call the function. And that's not our job right now. That's JavaScript's job when something else happens. So when this happens, do this. Unless I'm a filthy liar. Let's see if it works. I'm not a filthy liar. How dare you? Totally works. Yep.
Is the click inside the argument or the parameter is that working the same way as queries selected, where like it looks for the first click and then it does something when you click it?
No, it'll do it every time you do it. So if we did something crazy like let I equals 0, and then we said, like, what should we name it? Plus I plus plus. It'll change it, then we'll see. It'll just keep doing it, right? So it'll run update text every time you click this particular button. So no, it's any click, not just the first one. Good question. So that's basic event handling in JavaScript. Questions about this? You're going to do it yourself here in a sec. Yeah.
So is button given like its own
Say that again.
Like is
Okay, so yeah, I mean, that's built into your browser to do something. But if you wanted to control how it looks, yeah, you'd do that with style sheets. Yeah. Yep.
How is HTML and JavaScript, like these two files, how do they understand to work with one another? Like, they exist, but how are they able to recognize, like, hey, this is the HTML file that I'm...
Right, right. So in CodePen, that's happening magically. But we're getting ready to create our own project, and we'll have to do that manually. So we will answer that question, yeah, very shortly. Oh, no, it's not hard. No. Anybody else? Before we do our own thing?